In today's episode, we return to the Egyptian and Libyan desert as both the British Commonwealth and the Axis gear up for several dramatic campaigns in the second half of 1941.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So, returning to the hot and sandy shores of North Africa to have a look at what happens in the second half of 1941. As always, my first question is, where do we take it from here? So do we do a bit of introduction to the episode and tell our listeners how we've got to where we are and what we've talked about before?
It only makes sense, of course. The second half of 1941, that's when the North African War really heats up, but it doesn't come out of nowhere, of course. In the very briefest of nutshells, the war in North Africa begins in 1940 when Italy enters the war because they control Libya, it's one of their colonies, and the British control Egypt. It's one of their, not a direct colony, but a colonial possession, let's say. So the Italians invade in 1940, the British throw them out, push them hundreds of kilometers back across these thin coastal roads that are the only logistical line in this campaign. Then the Germans arrive and the British get distracted by the crisis in Greece. And Rommel takes command of a couple of German divisions in North Africa. And they sort of lead the charge in a big counteroffensive in March 1941. They capture a lot of territory. They penetrate a little bit into British Egypt, but they cannot capture the port of Tobruk, which the Australians primarily hold. So you have a situation in spring 1941 where the British have been pushed back, but now they're closer to their bases in Egypt, their supply bases. And the Germans and Italians have captured a lot of ground, but they're very far from their main supply base in Tripoli, all the way in the western part of Libya. And in the middle, you have this little isolated, besieged town held by the British and Australians of Tobruk, which the Axis has not been strong enough to capture. That is more or less the situation we find ourselves when the next campaign begins in May. Matthias, fill in the gaps here.
So we're now looking, well, the gaps, there are no gaps, so that's fine. I think we can move on and have a look at what goes on now, what happens here. As you've said, it's all about, in this scenario at the moment, it's all about Tobruk, isn't it? Because that really is, it's the logistical hub. If the Axis forces can seize Tobruk, it might open up the new sea lanes. It might make it easier to resupply the troops. You don't have to drive through the desert all the way from Libya. That makes it so much easier, so much more efficient. If you can make sure that the unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is Malta, is neutralized, then you might be on for some sort of a winner here in the North Africa campaign if you're sitting in the Axis camp. So this is why this is so very, very important. And of course, you might argue that for the British, Tobruk itself is not that important because they've got Alexandria, they've got the Suez Canal. But of course, they understand that you do have this importance for the Axis troops. So if you can relieve the siege, make sure that the Axis powers can't seize that harbor, can't use the harbor, then you stand a very good chance of pushing the Axis troops back. Perhaps, you don't know, you might even be able to then inflict another very, very hefty defeat on the Axis powers, as had happened before in 1940 against the Italians, and we talked about this in the previous episode. So all this leads now to the build-up of this big operation that the British are planning. But before they launch the big one, well, there's a small one, which you might say is a shaping operation, in order to prepare the ground for the big operation, which is then, as we've now said, supposed to relieve Tobruk. And this short one is Operation Brevity. It's kind of in the word, isn't it? You already mentioned it. And that is the idea. So there's some fighting in the area. So the main task really is is to seize the Halfaya Pass. We talked about that pass in the previous episode, because that controls the access from Egypt all the way, keep it relatively simple geographically, all the way to Tobruk. If you hold this, you can have a blocking position. At that particular time in May, this position is held by the Axis powers. At that stage, you've got Italians there. Later on, you will have German troops fighting them. At this stage, it's Italian troops defending that particular pass. You want to seize this, you want to defeat the Italians there, because that opens up the supply lines for troops for the next stage, which is then the attack onto Tobruk itself. So the British launch an attack. It's actually, as I said, it's a relatively small one. So you're only looking at on the British side. It's really a couple of infantry battalions. So it's in the continental European understanding, you're looking at a regiment. So the British listeners, that a regiment means something completely different. But for continental listeners, that's 3 battalions form 1 regiment. And about 50, the numbers fluctuate a bit between 50 and 53 tanks. And on the German side, you've got basically parts of several battalions fighting together, or the Axis, I should say, and somewhere in the region of 30 to 60 tanks. The attack, it goes off to a good start. So they managed to seize the Al-Fayr Pass after quite some heavy fighting. They push further to the west as well. But in the end, you then have a counterattack coming in, and it's now the Germans who are able to then re-seize the Al-Fayr Pass and re-establish this blocking position. So you might say this operation is a bit of a draw when it then eventually comes to an end. The casualties are, by the standards of North Africa, you might perhaps say for a small operation relatively high, which shows you the ferocity of the fighting. In the greater scheme of things of World War II fighting, they are reasonably low. So you're looking at somewhere in the region of 200 British casualties. I think it's 5 tanks destroyed, 6 aircraft are destroyed. And on the Axis side, you've got a few more. You're looking at around 600, but that includes the prisoners of war, particularly the Italians from the Al-Fayr Pass. So that's the shaping operation, which comes in, and which, Wavell thinks would be a very good idea to do if this goes well. Doesn't go all as well as he'd hoped, but it still means that you now need to go to the next level, the next operation, and that, of course, is the big one that comes in now. And this is the one that's really designed to relieve Tobruk and to break this ring that the Axis powers have created around Tobruk. So which operation is that, Jesse?
Well, this is, of course, Operation Battle Axe, which begins
That's the famous one.
begins in June 1941. I want to take a moment to raise us up to the strategic level here for a second to help us understand why are the British trying to do this so desperately? In addition to Tobruk, what are the other factors? And from the British point of view, of course, they want Tobruk. Right, this is key. They want to push the Axis back, but they've got so many problems in the Eastern Mediterranean theater at the moment. This is one of the reasons why to attack and defeat the British and Italians, the Germans and Italians in North Africa, it's also almost a political necessity, because Wavell is in charge of a huge area. I mentioned this, I think, in our previous episode on North Africa, but he's not only responsible for North Africa, he's responsible for the Middle East. Then you also have the expedition in Greece that's going on. So the British are stuck in a bunch of difficult positions. They have to evacuate in Greece because they are defeated there. There's a pro-Axis coup in Iraq, which they need to deal with in the middle of 1941. They're worried about the Vichy French in Syria and Lebanon. They've got to put some resources into keeping that under control. So you have all of these minor catastrophes or danger zones going on behind them. On the one hand, it has taken away some troops, but they've now reinforced in North Africa significantly. On the other hand, it means that somebody like Churchill, who's very concerned with the political side, understandably, is pressuring Wavell, saying we need to attack as soon as possible in North Africa, where we have a chance of success, to politically compensate for some of these politically damaging defeats, embarrassing defeats in Greece, or politically the coup in Iraq. Wavell is not opposed to offensive operations. He's a general. He wants to win the war, but he's more cautious. He says, look, we just got a bunch of fresh troops, a bunch of fresh equipment. They need time to learn desert warfare, which is very particular, and the equipment needs to be converted. You mentioned in our last episode, you need air filters and other things. It takes special maintenance to deal with the sand and all sorts of other specific factors to desert fighting. So you have all that going on behind the scenes for the British that goes beyond just what the shooting is designed to accomplish. On the Axis side, you have Rommel saying, hey, I want more resources. And then, you have some complaints about Rommel that come as well. Not everybody's a great fan of Rommel. You have Halder, for example, saying, who's in the German High Command, saying, hey, I'm getting letters from officers saying, and there's also some Italians who've written, critical assessments of Rommel, basically saying, the guy's kind of crazy. He runs around all day in his, probably in his Kubelwagen. I'm not 100% sure of that. That's usually how they do. He runs around all day visiting units. He dissipates his strength. He's trying to have raids here and raids there. He loses the overview of the front and of major operations. Some even say he's emotionally unpredictable or a little bit unstable. When things are going well, he's like bold, maybe even too ambitious. When things don't go that well, he becomes quickly pessimistic sometimes. So it's interesting that on both sides, away from the actual fighting, you have some turmoil. You have some things pulling you in different directions. And that's part of the lead up to the big British and Commonwealth attack, Operation Battle Axe.
Well, while we were talking, there were so many thoughts going through my head. Well, all these tangents. There's so many tangents in my head right now. So I'm just going to do a few tangents. Exactly. Let's do a few tangents. The first one is coming back to this whole Rommel thing. And again, I think we really need to do a bit more on Rommel himself, probably do an episode. We talked at length on kind of this whole idea of leadership and how all this is done in command and control, but maybe we can do a bit more on that as well in the future episode. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there were a lot of people who were criticizing Rommel for what he was doing. Today, you find a lot of kind of admiration for Rommel all across the board because, well, this is great. That's leading from the front. That's perfect. But when you actually get military people to understand these things, they take a step back and say, no, you shouldn't have been there because that's completely wrong. This is just wrong at pretty much every single level. There's a very, very interesting discussion to be had there about leadership style and all this. You might argue that he never outgrew the idea of a Stoßtrupp commander like in the First World War, where you're supposed to charge ahead as a young lieutenant ahead of your men to seize in his case, the Italian position at Scaporetto. So there is a bit of that, and he doesn't seem to outgrow this, which when you go to later campaigns of his, so when he's, for example, in charge of Italy, there's no fighting-wise in Italy, but the plan that he's got there, and also Normandy, where there's a big debate about his performance in Normandy, the big famous tank debate with him and Schweppenburg, all these things you can bring in there. And again, we've talked about this in previous episodes. Being a great tactical commander does not necessarily make you a great operational or strategic thinker. We always use Freiberg as the example, the New Zealand guy. I think Rommel, I would argue, probably falls a bit into the same category. We talked about Patton in the previous episode. I think there's some very striking parallels between these two. But that should be enough now because we're now turning this into the Rommel episode that we say we're going to do at some later stage. That's number one. The second thing is you're talking about Wavell and the forces and the pressures that these guys are under. Of course, we tend to look at this through a very, very Central European lens. Even if you're American, you're probably at this particular stage, you're concentrating very much on what goes on in Europe, perhaps a little bit in the Far East with Japan, but of course, America's officially not in the war yet. But the whole Middle East is nothing that most people, I would argue, but at least from continental Europe, really look at. It's just there, but it doesn't really play a role. You mentioned Iraq. That's important. Of course, you've got, for the British, the most important thing really in all of this, of course, is India. So that is important. That's the most important colony, the jewel in the crown, all that. So everything that you've got there, everything that you do in this part of the world, this basic to make sure that you've got the supply routes that go to and from India, keep them open. So to British thinking, this is really, really, really important. It's probably more important than most other things that happen in the world at that particular time. And it's very difficult to understand that if you don't have that particular imperial mindset. So the Germans, for example, they never understand this. So to them, all what happens there is really not important. They support what goes on in Iraq with a few planes, but you know what, that doesn't really matter. That's all. That's not even secondary or tertiary. That's whatever. It's completely not relevant for anything that happens anywhere else. The British see the world very, very differently. That has an impact on what they do there. And then the last bit that you raised is Syria, for example, is Lebanon, because you have the Vichy French there. And again, very often we tend to overlook this. And those days, these nations are practically, you might say, they are more or less at war. So there is the tension, there is the fighting in that part of the world. The British need to send more forces in there. So this is a really, again, an interesting aspect that, of course, after 1945, I think a lot of people didn't want to talk about because it's politically not the right thing to do. But we shouldn't forget that it's not been written out of history, but so everyone knows this, but it's something that I think we tend to underestimate. If you put yourself in the shoes of the British commander in 1941, that part of the world, I'd be slightly worried about what goes on in the areas that are controlled by Vichy or influenced by Vichy. And we can see this being played out later in, for example, Operation Torch as well, where they actually fight against the Allied forces landing. And one last point, and then I know we've all these tensions here. I've rambled for far too long again anyway. The other one, what I find really interesting, is the whole question of Palestine at that particular stage. And by that, I mainly mean the question of the Jewish settlers. I'm saying this because I once had a PhD student who wrote about this. His thesis was on what was the British attitude to the Jewish settlers in that part of the world at that particular stage. And that is really fascinating because you can see all sorts of British politics, prejudices, everything being played out there. So Churchill is saying very clearly, what I would like all of you guys to do is to equip the Jewish settlers, because let's face it, should the Germans break through in 1941, they do the same thing in 1942. So thinking about this, should the Germans break through, the people who probably fight the hardest would be the Jewish settlers, because they know what the fate is should the Germans get into what was then Palestine. And a lot of the British military and political commanders in that particular policy said, no, we're not doing this because we don't trust them. Some of them are, you might even say, anti-Zionist. Some of them are even anti-Jewish. Some of them say, well, there's already so much tension here in this part of the world. If we equip them, that's going to be a complete disaster. I mean, that is really quite an interesting little sub-theme all in itself. And as I said, it was good enough for one of my students to write his PhD on. So there we are. I found it was very interesting.
That is a very under the radar aspect of the war in this part of the world. You know, the British are worried because all of this uncertainty is sort of behind their main fighting line and close to the Suez Canal. That's the critical link to India that they are worried about. So all of this brings us to, where does the shooting begin? Operation Battle Axe. In June 1941, the British have now, they have a superior strength in this area to the Axis. They have twice as many tanks, twice as many aircraft available, but lots of inexperienced new reinforcements. These include several fresh Indian units that are going to play a prominent role in the fighting from now on. So the British launch Operation Battle Axe. The idea, of course, is to push the Axis out of Egypt and then capture on the Libyan coast this important besieged port of Tobruk. But it runs into problems. Battle Axe does. The British artillery is quite dispersed, so they're not able to really bring to bear the firepower like they would want to in order to break German and Italian positions, make it easier for the infantry and tanks to do their thing, capture the position and then exploit afterwards. Without artillery, it's very hard to do that. The Germans also make great use of their anti-tank guns. It's something we talked a bit more in detail about in the previous episode. But British tanks have trouble communicating with each other. One example is at a place called Point 208, a little piece of higher ground. The British commanders, they decide to abort the attack, but not all the British tanks get the message. Radios are not in every British tank. You mentioned that I don't know if it was in the previous episode or earlier in this one, Matthias. So this kind of command and control issue, plus German tactical aggression and smart tactics with their anti-tank guns, means that British armor runs into a lot of trouble. And they lose in this operation something like 100 tanks, and the Germans only lose about a dozen tanks. I mean, that's not a sustainable ratio, even if you outnumber your opponent. So Battle Axe is a bit of a fail in the end on the British side.
It is. You might say it is at least an operational. I wouldn't say disaster. That's probably too strong a word, isn't it? But it's definitely a defeat. And of course, the operational, and you might argue, pulling out of this one, the strategic implications to Brook, everything we talked about earlier, are very, very important. It's also interesting when you look at this, and again, when you compare what happens here in the North African campaign with any other campaign that you find in Europe itself. What always strikes me is how comparatively small all these actions are. By the standard of North Africa, this is a relatively big operation. But when you look at the numbers involved and the casualties, they are quite low, actually. So there is, and it only goes on for 3 days as well. So that's a relatively short, sharp event, I would say. One thing that I also find interesting is, again, when we return, because we talked about this a number of times now, is the different style and leaderships and how do you approach and how do you command a battle. And there's one episode on the 17th of June where the Germans pick up a radio message that is sent back from the British commanders. And so basically they're beginning to panic. They don't really know what's going on. The battle is not going well. They're asking for more orders. They want clarity. They want to see what's happening here. And say Wavell, he's basically with another chap, burst forward to Pierce and will receive this message. Okay, I need to sort this out. This is picked up by the Germans. And Rommel writes about this actually, and sends a message back. And he said, it sounded suspiciously as though the British commander no longer felt himself capable of handling the situation. It being now obvious that in their present bewildered state, the British would not start anything for the time being, I decided to pull the net tight by going on to Halfaya. So what Rommel is doing now is he's looking at the situation here in the battle area, the battle zone, and he realizes that there's confusion. There is panic is too strong a word, but there's confusion on the British side, and he realizes this means that the British are not going to act. So that means he can now begin to outmaneuver them to reoccupy the Halfaya Pass, and potentially in the next stage, if you can, perhaps even cut off British force and British troops. And this is really interesting from a leadership perspective and from a doctrinal point of view, because Rommel understands, as you just said, the British like very, very clear orders. There isn't a lot of mission command. Can lead to confusion very, very quickly. The moment you create this confusion, the British are not able to handle this at that particular stage. And this is what Rommel is saying. And this is where Rommel thrives, because this is exactly the situation that he wants to create, because this is the stormtroop commander that he still is by heart, because this is exactly what the idea of the stormtroops of the First World War is. You get into the enemy line, you get into the enemy trenches, you basically cause confusion and you spread panic. And within that in itself is enough to turn a battle, to win the battle. So here in this sentence, you can actually really see how these two different command cultures, which you might say were, in theory, the ingrained command cultures and doctrines in both armies. Of course, it doesn't mean that every unit, every soldier is acting this way. So it needs to be brought in through the commanders. And you can see this juxtaposition here, which I think really explains why quite often, as it does here during this particular Battle Axe, things turn out quite well for the Germans when they shouldn't have done, when you just look at the numbers that are involved and things like this. The problem, of course, as also we've discussed a number of times, that can give you the upper hand at the tactical level. The moment you go operational and strategic, where other things become more important, and we've talked about this to death in this episode, the last one, logistics, for example. You can win yourself to death tactically, but in the end, you're still dead, you're still defeated. You do it in a very good, heroic way, inflicting casualties on the enemy. But are you actually going to win the war? Yes or no? And that, of course, is the underlying issue. Again, jumping ahead when you go to 1943. But I think it's quite an interesting little snippet that you get here, from which you can extract quite a bit of bigger picture stuff when you compare the two nations at war, and also the two armies, and also the military commanders. And so it is true that Rommel didn't have bad things to say about Wavell. So he held him in relatively high regard, I have to say. But stuff is going to happen to Wavell anyway. Again, I don't want to jump ahead.
Well, we can get into it, but I mean, this idea of sort of winning the battles and losing the war, it's a common problem, right? Both the Soviet Union and the United States had several conflicts where you might say that they won a lot of the battles and then didn't get the end result in the war that they wanted, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan or what have you. For poor Wavell, poor Archibald Wavell, battle axe is pretty much the end of the line. You know, he's an aggressively minded politician. He wants to take the fight to the enemy, even when the tools that his generals have are limited in some cases. It's not always possible in the way that Churchill would envision it. But it's just too much in this case. And Wavell is then relieved. He's off to command in India. And he's replaced by the guy who was in command in India, a chap by the name of Claude Auchinleck, who now takes control of this big theater in the Middle East and in North Africa. The Germans are also sort of reorganized a little bit at this stage in the late summer, let's say, of 1941. In July, they reorganized their forces. They had the Africa Corps, but now they sort of smush it together with a couple of Italian corps, and they call it Panzer Group Africa. Much cooler sounding name for your formation, I suppose. There's a little bit of tension that's continuing as well on the Axis side. Halder's still upset with Rommel. He actually wants him replaced, but Rommel is kind of a favorite of Hitler's, so that doesn't work out either. And Rommel's convinced that Halder is just jealous because of all of Rommel's success. So that maybe reveals a slight bit about Rommel's psychology and ego. That his first thought, if someone doesn't like his command, that this is due to jealousy. In any case, you have continuing logistical issues for the Axis, especially because they're stretched out, right? They're all the way up into Egypt. And the British activity in the Mediterranean and from Malta is taking a toll on their convoys from Italy. Convoy losses, as we get into the second half of 1941, they jump up. I think previously there was something like 6 or 7 or maybe 8% of convoy shipping is lost. Second half of 1941, 26% of the already very scarce shipping, Axis shipping in the Mediterranean, is lost. So this is a problem. It's a problem just by the numbers, but it's especially a problem when you think about how complicated it is to supply troops in North Africa compared to on the Eastern Front. I read one estimate that it's something like 20 times the amount of total resources have to be engaged in order to supply a division in North Africa compared to in the USSR. And the front line, the main supply hub for the Axis, of course, is Tripoli. It's 1,600 kilometers to the front line in Egypt. So that's a very, very serious challenge.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about logistical issues, and in many ways, you might say it really is the war of logistics that's really being played out here in, as you just said, a far more obvious and clear way than in other theaters, Eastern Front or whatever. We've, of course, got similar challenges. This is very big, very vast, but you can do it a different way. You've got railroads, all these things that you don't really have here in North Africa. And we repeat ourselves a little bit. You put the weather on top, you put the sand on top, all these things, all these issues and problems that you find, that really, really is a big one. And of course, that also means that the Air Force plays a very, very important role here. And the Air Force is, to a large degree, it's not really about big bombing raids or something like this, but it is about strafing the enemy supply lines. And this is what goes on. And of course, the Royal Air Force is getting stronger even now in 1941. 1941, you might say it's probably still quite even, the fighting that happens here, but you can see, just like in other theaters, particular once the war in the East actually starts in June 1941, and the Germans are really concentrating with everything they've got on the Eastern Front, that now the Germans are again running into problems here. And of course, you do have Italian forces there. You also got Italian Air Force there, but a bit like the other force, particularly the army, their battle performance is perhaps not as good as it should have been and could have been. So that's it. It's mainly in the air to a large degree, I would argue, when you get the proper real fighting, the famous dogfights and what have you as well. That's more a German/Commonwealth thing. The most famous one, of course, is the most famous pilot there from the German side, Hans-Joachim Marseille. So the Stern von Africa, the Star of Africa, who, of course, is killed when he jumps out of the plane. At that stage, one of the most successful German fighter pilots, a rising star, very difficult character, apparently. Didn't like to obey orders and a bit of a troubled child, but extremely good pilot. And the tail of his Me-109 is now kept in the German Air Force Museum in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. I think
And
it is, isn't
buried,
it?
I've been to his grave accidentally. I
Yeah,
didn't know
yeah,
he's
yeah.
buried in the cemetery of a Lutheran church in Schöneberg district of Berlin, which was interesting. I saw there was a grave, I saw the dates, and I said, "Hey, there was a picture there. People had left flowers there, which okay, that can mean different things from human empathy to strange things. But in any case, I thought that was interesting that I stumbled upon it. Mild tangent. I don't want to take you off your main track here.
No, but Schöneberg is a very nice part of Berlin. There we are. It's very good.
It is.
Because that's where he was from, obviously. And first he's buried, of course, in the desert where he goes down. And then the body's exhumed. And there we are. And now I've got no idea where we're going with this. Because of
That's
now,
okay.
again, lost
I
completely.
do.
There we are. There we go.
Teamwork.
Just
It's all about teamwork. You've got one guy leading the charge, the other guy's organizing the logistical trucks, right? It's just how it works in a good operation. So both sides have to kind of reset after this heavy fighting in May and June, where the British essentially failed to break through. Both sides reorganize a bit. The British reorganize into the 8th Army, becomes the famous 8th Army that eventually Montgomery will command and all of that. And they try to build up their forces because both sides are planning for an offensive in November. Rommel wants to, once and for all, capture Tobruk, so he's planning for that. And the British are planning to relieve Tobruk and perhaps get a decisive victory in North Africa. So, because of the supply difficulties, the British get more new stuff for their offensive than the Axis do. By November 41, when all this new round of fighting is going to begin, Rommel does have some new tanks, but not that many. In total, he has 250 operational German tanks and about 150 operational Italian tanks, which are not as good. The Fiat M13 is one of the primary Italian tanks, and it's outdated. Even though the Ariete Armored Division is considered capable by the Germans. I think it's come up before in our talks about North Africa. On the British side, they're getting loads of supplies. They're getting thousands upon thousands of trucks. They get new tanks. They get US Stuart tanks. They get British Crusader tanks, British Valentine tanks. They have in November 700 operational tanks and 200 in reserve. So we're talking 900 available or soon to be available versus 400. That's a ratio that you're going to be happy with if you are the British. There's also a new British operational commander who arrives, Alan Cunningham. He transfers from East Africa, but he's not that used to the type of fighting and the size of forces that are going to be involved here. So let's say he's inexperienced for what he's about to try to do, which is launch a major offensive with large armored forces. He hasn't got a lot of experience with that from East Africa. So that is kind of the background to where we are when in November, the British strike first. They beat the Germans to the punch. We don't hear that often in the first couple of years of the war. So I want to revel in that along with all of our British and Commonwealth viewers and listeners. The British beat the Germans to the punch and strike first, and they launch Operation Crusader. Ah, God, that felt good.
Yeah. Well, they do. Well, they do. That's the way it is, isn't it? Yes, absolutely right. Every now and then that happens. So, on the 18th of November, the attack comes in. And you might say, in some ways, because again, terrain plays a role, doesn't it? And it's some of these actions are a little bit um, channeled and canalized by the terrain that you find. You might say, in some of the ways, the plans that you can see are a bit of a replay of the earlier fighting against the Italians here. So trying to outmaneuver the forces, if you can at all, try to encircle the enemy forces and then basically force them to surrender. Because once you've cut off forces in the desert, well, give them a day or two and they run out of water. It's very, very simple, isn't it? That's the reason why you get all these very, very high surrender rates. And of course, the other big thing that they want to do is, as we've now mentioned before, is to relieve the forces that are in Tobruk. So the Australians who've been now in the under siege for quite some time, actually, for a long, long time. So they're supposed to be relieved. And this is actually achieved on the 21st of November, so 3 days into the campaign, when the Allied forces get towards Tobruk and the Germans realize, you know what, this at the moment, there's nothing we can do here. They have to lift the siege. And in particular, Rommel, he's very sad, upset, angry, whatever you want to call it about it, because this was, for him, that was the prize. And he tries everything in his power to avoid this from happening. But he realizes that the Allied forces are at this particular stage just too strong. Now, this is also interesting because earlier I said that up to this stage, most of the fighting that you find here at that particular stage, the forces are reasonably small compared to what you find in other theaters of war. So this Crusader is the beginning of the change, you might say, when it comes to this, because the operation is quite big and the forces that are involved are very, very strong. Because, as you said, particularly Allies have now had the time to build up forces and to then use that material and the manpower that they've got to trying to outmaneuver and or just crush the Axis forces in this particular part of the world. And this is now becoming, you might say, the story for the rest of the wars as well. Against this superiority, the Germans don't really have an awful lot they can put into field at the beginning, at that particular stage. And that is why the Allies are able to break through and lift or lift the siege or relieve the troops that are in Tobruk. So the Australians are very, very happy at that particular stage.
Yeah, I would be too if I were stuck in Tobruk for months at a time and there's a chance to actually get out and be sure that I'm not going to go into enemy captivity. Crusader, in a way, maybe it's me. Maybe it's just because I'm not super deeply read on the campaign in North Africa. But Crusader is a bit confusing in a way. You have the Commonwealth forces that are divided up into several different sort of strike groups. As you say, the terrain almost kind of isolates some of the fighting into different areas. And you also have some confusion on the ground. So even the people involved are not always clear on what's going on. The Germans at first are surprised. Their intel, shockingly, doesn't warn them sufficiently about what the Brits are trying to do. The Brits are hoping to draw out the German tanks into a kind of decisive tank battle, but at first the Germans don't take the bait. So it's not quite clear if that's going to happen or not. There's a couple of running tank engagements where the Germans probably get the better of the British, but then the Germans also withdraw. So they don't hold the field. The Brits, capture an airfield. They destroy some planes on the ground. The Tobruk garrison is breaking out at the same time. As you mentioned, Rommel is still thinking he's going to launch his attack before he calls it off. Then there's a much bigger tank clash that happens near a place called Sidi Rezeg. And it lasts for several days. And by all accounts, it's a confusing affair, right? Finding tanks in the clouds of sand or around the corner or in the mirage and the shimmering of the heat or what have you, firing at each other. And the Germans eventually, and the Italians, get the better of the British in this major tank engagement. And they defeat parts of the 7th British Armored Division, which is a reputable formation, and they also defeat the South African Brigade that's fighting in that area. They end up destroying in total, during this operation, something like 450 British tanks. That's a lot. That's what, when you're starting with 750 or whatever it was, and you lose 450, it's quite significant. But that doesn't mean the British are defeated. So there's this initial phase of tons of confusion, and then you have some German success, but it doesn't mean the Brits are done.
That is very true. So the British, because they keep getting more reinforcements in as well, so they can, to a degree, you might say, they can afford some of these losses, which the Axis powers can't, just because of the material situation. It's interesting that then the British are given the order by Auchinleck to, at this particular stage, another order is, well, basically we need to continue the fight, and what we're going to do now is that we're going to drive the Axis powers out of the Cyrenaica, and we're going to re-seize all of that, and if possible, we're going to destroy the forces. So even at that stage, they're still thinking about, okay, we can swing this, we can win this one, because they realize, again, that the Battle of Materiel is working in their favor. You then have more tactical actions where you can also see some more attacks are coming in, but you can now see again that in particular, I would argue, the leadership issues of these troops that you find on the Allied side are really beginning to show. And they're also beginning to show not only against the Germans, but they're also beginning to show now against the Italians, for example. So at a place, for example, called Bir el Gubi, by the 4th of December, I think it is, I've got the quote here, there is another engagement. And so the Italians are being attacked. It's Italian unit now, they're being attacked, and they successfully defend their position against an Indian contingent for, I think it's 3 days. In the end, German tanks also arrive, about 50 German tanks. That, of course, helps massively. But the analysis, quite interesting, of the battle performance of the Indian troops here on the British side talks about something very different. It says, although Norrie, so that's the commanding officer, had an overwhelming superiority in every arm in the area of Bir el Gubi, the failure to concentrate them and coordinate the action of all arms in detail had allowed one Italian battalion group to frustrate the action of his whole corps and inflict heavy casualties on one brigade. I mean, that sums up in many ways, you might say, not only the fighting here in this particular battle, but as we've now said a number of times before, the doctrinal approach that you find in the British/Commonwealth army or armies at that particular stage. The British army gets better and better and better as the war goes on, but here at this stage, you still find this very ill-coordinated fighting. So every service is pretty much fighting its own war. If one battalion, as you can see, as it says here, and one battalion can actually hold an entire corps, I mean, that is quite impressive. Yes, you've got the German tanks arriving as well, but I think it just speaks to the issues that you find in that British military at that particular time, which is an army which you might argue the troops here, most of them, that's the first time they really see large-scale action, whether it's this particular battle or perhaps the battles and engagements we talked about before. But this is also an army, of course, which was never designed to do something like this. This is not an army that is thinking in corps and armies. This is an army that thinks in battle groups, battalions, or regiments, which basically is a battalion in the British understanding of the term, because that's the colonial thinking. And suddenly you take an army trained completely differently, different ethos, put it all together, and now you're doing something very different. So that, of course, is the big problem that the British army is facing. So in some ways, when we sometimes say, the British weren't fighting all that well, and they're not great, and the Germans are much better, you might say perhaps that's true at the tactical level, but it's also a bit unfair. And there's a very, very steep learning curve that you can find here in the British camp. I know that some people have accused me of being anti-British, so I hope I've redeemed myself here now.
I think it's fair to say at this stage in the podcast, we've both been accused of being anti-everything, pretty much.
Pretty much, yes.
Whatever, I'll run with that. But I think that there are bright spots for the British, in spite of perhaps these limitations of flexibility or command culture. The New Zealanders in this battle, they really distinguish themselves. They fight very hard. They defeat quite a few Axis positions. This is in this critical phase where Cunningham is considering breaking it off and retreating, and Auchinleck says, no, we're gonna keep on fighting here. That's a symbol of this British determination that, look, despite the problems we have, we're going to try to get the job done. And if you don't want to fight, you're never going to win, no matter if you make mistakes or not. If you want to fight, you have a chance. And At that moment, the New Zealanders are kind of having some significant success. I'm not saying they're responsible for everything, but they're one of those signs to Auchinleck, we can still pull this off. Even though the Brits then lose this important position of Sidi Rezeg. The new commander, by the way, I forgot, is Neil Ritchie. So Ritchie is now responsible for the operation specifically. He recognizes, okay, we've had a rough time of this, but the enemy is still in a weaker position than us. They are fewer in number. They don't have the resources. They don't have as many tanks. They cannot replace their tank losses as we partially can. So we're going to, and the way the fighting developed, the Germans had spread themselves out to make sure to fight all the different fires that are popping up. So now you have your most dangerous enemy spread out and divided. And so this is kind of part of the turning point. Rommel has no more reserves. And the British then keep up the pressure. And even though they don't come up with some master stroke of surrounding and encircling or whatever, it becomes clear to Rommel that he has no chance of pulling this out of his hat. He's not going to win. He did try quite a controversial move. At one point earlier in the battle, he says, 21st Panzer Division, rush for the border with Egypt. Just go ahead. Just go for it. Doesn't matter. Come what may, do something kind of unexpected to confuse and disorient the British, and the rest will take care of itself. And it doesn't work. They do rush for the border, then they cross it, but they don't have a clear objective that's going to contribute to turning the tide of this battle. And of course, they have limited fuel. So they basically take themselves out of the main fight, go on an excursion in the sand, and then get ordered to return. So this does not reflect that well on Rommel's judgment. It's sort of being bold for the sake of being bold without a clear purpose. And in the end, the Axis have to withdraw, and Tobruk is relieved by the Commonwealth forces.
Absolutely right. And say on the 15th, 16th of December, that's when they realize, well, you know what, the game here is up, and Rommel orders the retreat, which of course you might say is interesting. Again, if we jump ahead just slightly again, I like doing this in this episode. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm jumping ahead quite a bit. Comparing that to what goes on later on at Alamein, where of course he's ordered to stand and fight and not withdraw, and then you might argue the order was given a bit too late. So here we still got freedom of movement and command. So he then orders the retreat, and for about 10 days now they now withdraw and retreat, and that is the good thing, you might say, in inverted commas, for the Axis troops, because they withdraw in order. And unlike the previous operation that the British had conducted in this area, which leads to the 130,000 Italian soldiers going into the back, so they are able to withdraw in an orderly fashion, and the British are following, but they're not able to outmaneuver the Axis force as they withdraw, going through the desert and cut them off. That doesn't really happen. And you then have, after about 10 days, roughly speaking, you have then a meeting. It's pretty much a meeting engagement where the advanced group of the 8th Army basically runs into a German defensive position, gets a bit of a bloody nose, withdraws, and that gives the Axis force a bit of breathing time as well, and then they can go back to Alageila and establish a proper defensive position there. And then the pendulum has swung back into the other direction. Now the Commonwealth forces are overextended, have culminated, are exhausted, and you reach the next phase of the operation. At the same time, what you also have, of course, is at the very, very east, you still have these Axis positions, like, for example, in the Halfaya Pass that I've now mentioned a number of times. You still got about, roughly speaking, 2,500 German troops, I think about 4,000 Italian troops under this command of this German guy I mentioned him before, this former priest. It's a Major Bach, he's called. There is some very interesting fighting. So the South Africans surround the pass, and you then get fighting for several days. But in the end, these troops then surrender, and that is, roughly speaking, 6,000 prisoners that the Allies take. So that in itself is actually quite an impressive achievement. And so Rommel had argued and ordered for the withdrawal of these troops. But first of all, the Italian High Command, first of all, had said no, and then by the stage the battle had already developed and devolved, it was too late to get them out because they're basically behind the enemy front line, and it simply wouldn't have worked. The same thing happened at a place called Bardia or Badia, which was attacked by the South Africans on the 16th of December, where again you were looking at about 2,200 German troops and somewhere in the region of around 6,000 Italian troops that fight through. But then in January as well, they surrender, and that's over. So when you look at the numbers, just these two actions together, somewhere in the region of, roughly speaking, I'm not entirely sure now, 12,000 or so. That's quite a blood loss when you look at the figures and the numbers that the Germans and the Italians have in this area. So you might say, was a success, was not a success? Well, the verdict, I think, is out. Less of a disaster than the other operations at that particular stage for the Allies. I would say, well, it achieved not all of its aims, because it doesn't really crush the Axis forces, but it conquers quite a bit of the territory. They take a lot of prisoners, and the important thing, you might argue, is, of course, Tobruk. I think they were trying to hope and achieve more. It was more about a complete destruction of the Axis forces in this area. But when you look at the British forces or the Commonwealth forces, their training, all these shortcomings that they're facing, it's probably not a bad outcome, I would say.
Yeah, I think we can say, or I would say, it's a British victory. It's not the complete victory that they had envisioned, but it's a significant victory. They've relieved Tobruk. They've thrown the Axis back many hundreds of kilometers. They also inflicted twice as many casualties as they took. Now, that's not the best measure necessarily of victory or not victory, but it does tell you that the British are really fighting and really inflicting damage. The figures I have seen, there's something like 18,000 British killed and wounded in Crusader, 14,000 German, and 24,000 Italian, plus then the prisoners of war on the Axis side in addition to that. So that's 2-to-1, or slightly more than 2-to-1 casualties inflicted. As far as tanks go, the British lose a lot more. They lose about 530 tanks. But because they're in possession of the ground, they can repair about half of them and put those back into operation. The Axis lose about 300 tanks, which is the vast majority of what they had operational before, and they can recover none of those. So even though, and there's some worry among British ranks and officers and discussions in London that, well, we won, but we almost decided to retreat in the middle of this operation. The Germans got the better of the biggest tank engagement that we had. But in the end, they essentially smashed the Axis tank force in North Africa in this battle. Yes, the Germans can send more tanks, and they do, but they've got almost nothing to work with at the moment, which is a pretty significant thing. So I feel like, Auchinleck doesn't get enough credit for his decision to fight, to keep going, to just say, no, we're digging our heels in here, guys. Our chaps, I guess he would have said, not guys. And we're going to see it through because I think that we can achieve it. And that's something that that different allied countries had a tough time achieving up until around this point in the war.
Absolutely right. And it's Auchinleck, of course, and he had very nice things to say about Wavell as well. When they basically changed their position, you might say that's just courtesy. But I think when you read what he had to say about him, it sounds like he actually meant him, and he actually acknowledges the fact that this is a very difficult theater of war. He says this is some that bit of a backwater that not a lot of people know stuff about. It's also, I think he says, the 40 languages being spoken in this army. So, British troops. So you can see all this. He says, I inherited that from Wavell. He did a very good job, and then boom, you put that into practice, into reality, whatever. Implement our thing. It's I mean, by the standard of the day, that's an impressive victory, isn't it? As you said, you haven't crushed the army, but there's not much left in the Afrika Korps at the moment. If the British hadn't run out of steam at that particular time, but had a few more, let's say 200 tanks up the sleeve, plus another 3 divisions and lots and lots and lots of water and petrol. That could have been the end. That could have been the end of the story. Exactly, but you know what I mean. So it's yeah, but it's. As when I say it's not that bad, well, that basically means it's a British victory. There's no two ways about it. And of course, it's also, when then look at this, because you talked about the logistical resupply that we stressed to death. Now, of course, there's stuff happening in other fronts as well. So, and that, of course, mainly for the Germans. I mean, we talked about this many times. I'm saying, well, for the Germans, the focus is, of course, on the Eastern Front. When you look at what happens on the Eastern Front at that particular time, that's not looking good. When you also know that at that particular time, Hitler had ordered industry to shift gear because he thought that the war in the East is won. We don't need tanks anymore. All we need is U-boats and planes. So you can see, well, there is a lot of stress in the German system now when you look at the bigger picture here, which is going to make the situation for Rommel and other people in that theater not very nice indeed. So, yeah, it's
foreshadow.
Not bad at all. Not bad at all. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think that's a very British way to end up this episode on the campaign in North Africa in the second half of 1941, which sees some British struggles, but in the end, some British success as well. If you liked what you heard or saw today, why not consider becoming a supporter of the podcast to make more content like this possible? We'd be happy if you decided to do that. Of course, you can find out more about that at our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. If you become a supporter, you can even get access to exclusive content that's not available to the general public. You can free trial our war room where all this exclusive content is uploaded using the code DeepDarkWoods. So that was it for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. And we're live, everybody, live in the middle of frickin' World War II.
As long as it's only 2, not 3, we're okay.
Yep. Pretty sure the internet will be down in World War III. Just a hunch.